Fantastic. Well, we'll make a slow and steady start as people are hopefully filtering into the call. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jane McMahon. I'm a senior consultant at Mutual Ventures and I lead our cooperative work. So really delighted to be welcoming you to this joint webinar between Mutual Ventures and Bates Wells, where we'll be discussing how a cooperative framework for local authorities can really help build communities and ensure that public services and businesses are ingrained in the communities that they serve. COVID crisis has laid bare, a number of challenges for public services, communities, local people, and community leaders. As we begin to recover from COVID-19, it's important, and local authority leaders and business leaders know that it's important we don't just return to business as usual. We really need to think about how we can navigate the uncertainties of the current time to sustain some of the positive things that happened during COVID, joint working, etc., but how we can really tackle those challenges laid bare by COVID-19. For us, that has to be about growing resilient communities, whether that's public services, businesses, community groups and individuals. It's about how local areas can work in partnership to build back stronger. We've created a cooperative framework that we'll introduce today, and each and every panel member we've got, it's central to the work they do in their day-to-day lives. So we're really excited to have this morning's discussion. Firstly, I'll just briefly introduce Mutual Ventures as host today. So Mutual Ventures is a management consultancy. We specialize in public service design and implementation. We're passionate about making public services better and more sustainable. And we work with local authorities, government departments, NHS organizations, charities, and social enterprises. In addition to that, we are delighted to be co-hosting today's event with Bates Wells. Bates Wells and Mutual Ventures have worked in partnership for many years, including being joint partners on the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support's Mutual Support Programme that helps public service organisations consider public service mutuals that put power in the hands of staff. Bates Wells is a full-service UK 100 law firm and has developed a nationwide reputation as a leader in the field of public services and public sector spin-outs. So Mutual Ventures and Bates Wells are passionate about cooperation as a vehicle for engaging community. That's why we're both proud to be members of the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network, which in welcoming Birmingham City Council welcomed its 75th member recently. So before I introduce our panel and our cooperative framework, I just wanted to let you know that today's session is a really open discussion format. So we'll be hosting a roundtable with our panel members where we'll get the opportunity to take the discussion where it goes, driven by the questions you ask. So please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. The questions are anonymous, so feel free to ask whatever's on your mind, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible, and we'll follow up with those that we don't have time to answer today. So with that in mind, I'll introduce our excellent panel, a panel that's ready to provide some really great insight into how public services have responded to the pandemic and how community-based organisations are well placed to respond. First, I'd love to introduce Abby Rumbold. Abby is a partner at Bates Wells and a charity lawyer with a particular specialism in social enterprise and the delivery of public services. Abby was one of the originators of the community interest companies and was seconded to government to design this, what I think we'd all agree was a massive step forward in hardwiring social value into businesses and social enterprises. I'd also love to introduce Scott Darragh. Scott is Chief Executive of Social Adventures. Social Adventures deliver health and social care contracts after spinning out of NHS Salford in 2011. They also run a social business with childcare nurseries, training, community gyms and forest schools. And Scott serves on the Greater Manchester Social Enterprise Advisory Group. And finally, we have Andrew Laird. Andrew is Managing Director and co-founder of Mutual Ventures. He's a specialist in local government strategy and is recognised by the government as an expert in alternative delivery models for public services. Andrew will also be able to bring his experience from serving on the board of Possibilities, which is a successful social care spin-out in Rochdale. So I hope you'll agree we've got a fantastic set of speakers and an interesting topic to talk about. So just before we dive into some of the questions, let me just briefly introduce the framework for our discussion today, which is about cooperative forms of recovery. Our framework is about recognising that if a local authority wants to lead the community that it serves out of the COVID crisis stronger, it needs to embed cooperation at every level. For us, that starts at the top, about getting partner organisations to work together strategically and collaboratively. And one of the positives that has spun out of the crisis is the way that local councils, NHS organisations, businesses and others have come together to put organisational barriers aside and make a difference. So that must continue. Secondly, it's about how local people can be embedded into public services. There has been a huge surge in support for public services during the crisis, and we need to make sure that local people feel that ownership over the services they rely upon. Thirdly, it's about making sure that businesses are connected to their community. I know in my village and my community that people have been willing to go above and beyond to support those businesses that are ingrained in their communities. But what role do local authorities have in fostering those kind of community-based businesses and social enterprises? Again, one of the real positives out of the COVID-19 crisis has been the way that local streets and neighbourhoods have come together to support each other, with mutual aid groups springing up across the country. How do local authorities and communities support those groups to continue as we move on from the pandemic? And finally, how do we support individuals to support themselves and to empower themselves to take control of their health and well-being? We believe this is a framework that was, if implemented as part of a council strategy, can empower communities and build back better from the crisis. So we're really excited to talk about our framework, and more details can be found on our full report on our website. But without further ado, I will stop sharing the screen and I will fire over some questions towards our panel. And as we said, please make sure you're popping your questions into the Q&A function so that we can respond to the things that are on your mind this morning. So Scott, my first question is to you. As a chief executive of a community-based organisation, how were you able to react to the initial crisis? Do you think being co-owned and embedded with your community made a difference to you on the ground?
Definitely, yeah. I'll start off with saying that this isn't a virtual background, by the way. This is actually my other half's tasting funky wallpaper. But yeah, I think being kind of part of the system in Salford, but not actually necessarily part of the public sector in Salford, allowed us to be much more agile at the start of the COVID crisis. So it allowed us to react very quickly to the needs that were changing on the ground. I think because we're co-owned by staff and service users, it meant that we were very much at the coalface in terms of what was going on the ground. So one of the things that we were able to do is change our headquarters into a hot site for COVID triage. So we were able to kind of change the whole service model virtually overnight as a result of being very able to be agile and change what we were doing. I think with the as we've gone through the process, we've gone through like a 4-stage process. We've been in that initial reacting phase. We've then gone through a kind of a reset phase where we've looked at what we do as an organisation and how that will need to adapt to the kind of changing landscape that we found in front of us. We're now going through a recovery phase, and then eventually we'll be in a respond phase. And I think having the staff and the service users embedded in the co-production of those changes has allowed things to move very quickly, but also we've been able to adapt because it's very clear that post-COVID things will have to adapt and change. And I think having that input from those stakeholders has been key really to us being able to do that at the pace that we've been able to do it. I think also the way that the system itself has adapted has been really important as well. And I think we've been seen very much as a system player rather than something slightly on the periphery of the system. And I think being embedded in that system locally has been really important because, again, we've needed to have a very command and control model of kind of controlling what's been going on the ground, and things have been centralized in a lot of senses, but also the actual the needs of people have been very localized. So you need to be able to have those anchor kind of organizations on the ground that are linked into local communities.
Great. And as we come out of the crisis now, and you talk about that command and control nature, which was needed in the depths of a crisis, what role do you think that local community-based structure you have will mean going forward as we sort of try to recover and maybe move away from some of the command and control things that were needed over the last couple of months?
Yeah, I think we're starting now to see things re-emerge. The primary care networks that had stopped happening while COVID was happening, they've started to re-emerge again and started to reconvene. A lot of the kind of the large scale kind of citywide kind of discussions we're having are now going back towards neighbourhoods, and we're having more conversations about how we build resilience into local neighbourhoods. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we're learning from the COVID crisis in terms of what went well with kind of centralizing some of the command and control models, but also what we lost as a result of that. So I think there's been a lot of learning and a lot of taking stock being done by all kind of parts of the system around that, and that's been part of that reset phase that I talked about.
Great. So, I mean, Andrew, from the work we've been doing with a number of councils around, how are they finding the kind of transition from the initial crisis into the next phase, and what are the key things that are on their mind, that's referring to what Scott's been talking about?
Yeah, Jamie, thanks very much. And just to say, it's really good to be on this with you and Abby and Scott as well. I think it's a really interesting topic. So we've been working with a number of councils to help them plan recovery. And one of the key things that the better councils are accepting and coming through with is that it's really important to try and plan to recover to where you want to be rather than where you were, because the world has changed a lot over the past 5-6 months. And you know, it's a really big opportunity to reset how public services are delivered and the relationship that they have with communities and community-based organizations. And a real concern that leaders have is that once the crisis passes eventually, that everybody will return to business as usual and will return to working in their own organizations in the very siloed way that some of them used to. And the more forward-thinking leaders are working very hard at the minute trying to figure out how to lock in some of that really good cooperation, not just for the duration of the crisis, but for the longer term as well. And you know, you may in your area be experiencing really good integration and really good cooperation, but you know, be in no doubt that once the crisis passes, without firm action, people will drift back to their comfort zones and doing things the way they've always done things. So to answer your question very directly, the councils who are planning ahead, they are still in the midst of this crisis, but they are making time to do that forward thinking. So if you think of the fact that quite unusually, they're meeting quite regularly. So the key leaders in an area, from police, fire and rescue, council, NHS, voluntary sector, are all meeting regularly under Gold Command or community resilience forums. And some areas are taking advantage of that and extending meetings to do a bit of strategic thinking, as well as dealing with the tactical stuff as well. And when you're thinking ahead, you need to be thinking about all of the different elements of what your strategy in your place looks like. So thinking about all of the people elements, thinking of place, thinking of infrastructure, and thinking of the role of business as well. And you know, I completely understand that it's very difficult to find that space, but it's so important that people do.
Great. And Abby, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that you know, we look at organisations like Social Adventures and the way that they are community embedded? What's some of the ways that people can hardwire that community-based approach into businesses and social enterprises? And what are, I suppose, some of the tools and tricks that local authorities or others might use to make sure they can trust that that stuff is hardwired for the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I was particularly, just when you were talking, Scott, and you were describing Social Adventures as being more of a system player in the environment during the COVID. And I think trying to work out ways in which organisations can become system players has got to be at the heart of how we develop and how we move back into we sort of move back into a different world. I know that for lots of social enterprises, feeling that they're on the outskirts of things and not being able to make the contribution that they want to make has been one of the real barriers. So yeah, absolutely, Scott, that kind of system player kind of concept, I think, is really important. I think, sorry, Jamie, I kind of snuck that in before I got into my question, but I in terms of this question about how you hardwire, I think it comes down to a sort of spectrum really between voice at one end and control at the other, where the sort of issues around kind of governance and communication. So if we're thinking about communities, is it that we're wanting to give governance and involve them in governance? Is it just about communication, and where is it on that that line that we're hoping to fall? So if we started at the kind of voice end, I can think of some organisations who are just really fantastic at giving their community a voice, and they don't necessarily do that in any kind of legal way. They do that via all the myriad different ways that you can reach out to people, some of which is kind of online and all of those sorts of things, and surveys and so on. And some of it is about just speaking to people and finding ways to get ground level comments into decision making further up the organisation. And I mean, even as a lawyer, you come up with various legal solutions, but I don't think you should ever forget that just getting the views of people up to the decision makers is probably one of the most important things. And then at the other end, there are organisations which have really strong and very clear structures around sort of democratic ownership, effectively, where you have the community voting on directors onto the board of an organisation, or you have community ownership of an organisation. And then between that, there's a whole mixture of different things that you can do. So you might have full-on ownership, as I've said, or you might just have a membership type arrangement. So in the same way that you might be a member of your local gym, but you don't own it, but you'll nevertheless have a stake in what it does and how it works. Then you might have expert panels. I certainly think we don't treat the community enough as experts in certain areas, and think about how can we bring them in. So advisory panels and expert panels could be really helpful as well. I suppose on the slightly negative side, the only thing that I would be wary of is I've definitely got some clients who are very, very strongly engaged in the community, but who also find it quite difficult to move through decision making. So they can be quite sluggish and quite slow, and sometimes find themselves in a real stasis. I can think of one organisation which has really struggled over the last couple of years to move forward, and they've, and as a result of that, they lose senior staff, because it's very difficult to work in an organisation where you can't really take it in the direction that you know it needs to go. And so trying to find a balance between ensuring there's some dynamism and there's the ability to take swift decisions, particularly as the world is kind of changing in this crazy way as it is at the moment, while still allowing for the community to have a voice. It's that balance which is the really tricky thing. And then finally, I'll let someone else speak in a minute, but the last thing that I think's worth saying on that, which is I know often with community assets, local authorities and the community are really anxious to protect them, and actually having community ownership can be a way of creating that protection. So I know one organisation which had a very valuable asset, and in order to protect it, what they did was effectively give every member of the community a vote, knowing that it would take 100% of everybody to agree what to do with this asset before anything could happen. And in that way, they protected it without having to have a sort of third-party regulator or local authority or somebody else acting as a sort of policeman over what they did with their asset. The asset belonged to the community, but by making sure everybody had a view, they actually locked it and kept it secure.
Great. Scott, just picking up on something Abby said there about quick response and having the freedom to do that. We've had a question in from a friend of all of ours, Justin Gibbling from Ripple's Kick, who we all know very well, just saying about, were there any surprises for you regarding the community issues you needed to tackle, or was it just actually about the community needed more of what you already provided? So I thought that linked well to Abby's bit about, in the middle of a pandemic, you're having to be quite fleet of foot as an organisation, and you've got that balance between robust community processes but not being too much administration. So was there anything as a bit of a shock that the community suddenly needed?
I think the surprise was basically how much asset and resource we had in the local areas that we were working in, and how we just needed to redeploy those assets to the needs of the local people. So I think it was. I think the response that we got was almost overwhelming. Actually dealing with the response that we got, things like volunteers, for instance, actually managing, a team of volunteers we were producing at one point, nearly 1,000 meals a week for NHS frontline staff that were being prepared by volunteers and sent out. So, sometimes it was actually the kind of response from the local people that was overwhelming. It was actually trying to kind of deal with the level of response that we were getting, and trying to deploy that in the right sort of way. And I think different parts of the system at different times had different. There was different hotspots in the system, and I think being able to kind of be part of the discussions, both at kind of a very macro level, looking at what was going on across the city, but also at a very local level in the communities that we were working, allowed us to kind of come up with some very interesting responses and innovation, and a lot of that was driven by local people on the ground and by staff as well, because they were empowered to do things in a rapid way.
Great. John, we've just had another really good question popped into the Q&A, which is we talk about local services running at silos, but government works in silos. So, Andrew, I mean, from the conversations we've been having with government, we know that government works in silos. How can we break down those silos at a national level as well as at a local level?
Yeah. Can I just check that people can hear me a little bit better?
That's perfect for me.
Right. Sorry about that earlier. So, I mean, this is the key question that all sorts of governments tackle with, and I think there are three things that I think local areas can do immediately. So if we start locally, you can co-locate teams. So I think during the crisis, we've seen community hubs popping up where professionals and volunteers from different areas have come together and have worked together, either virtually or physically side by side. So co-locating teams is a really good way to get people to start working together. Then I think you have to do the hard work around service design and looking at the pathways for each of your individual vulnerable groups, because they require, as everybody in this panel and everybody listening will know, that if you're an older vulnerable person, you need help from a range of agencies. If you're a young person in care, you need help from a range of agencies. We've got to do that service planning around what that looks like, so that the case can be made to join up teams. And then the final bit is around funding. This all relies on that. So you can do all of the planning you want, but if you can't settle the funding, particularly between councils and the NHS, then you're not going to make much progress. Now, individual areas have made really good progress on this. So, it's not fair to point at central government and say that it's their fault that we can't do this. It can be done. There just has to be the will, and the senior leaders in the local organisations, in the NHS and the council, really have to want to do it.
Great. So, Abby, yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say around that co-location point, I think can be really helpful to some of this. I think some of the real beacons of where some of the kind of health and care silos have broken down have been where there's been a co-location. And Scott, I mean, I think Social Adventures is probably the perfect example of this, but there are others as well. And we had a conversation prior to this about community anchors and where we can find community anchors that can act as a point where different services can come together and to create that balancing. So I know of one in Northamptonshire, which is in fact a nursery, but actually has built upon that to create a range of services becoming absolutely central to its community. So it's created sort of adult education and various other support services, mental health, and a variety of different things which are really supporting families across the piece in the area and creating that anchor for vulnerable people.
Right. We've had another question popped in, which I think is very timely for both, particularly for Scott and also Andrew, with your possibilities hat on. What insight or advice do you have for those social enterprises that are working across multiple geographies, where actually those local communities and local connections are harder to foster? And I suppose, how would you as organisations sort of think about fostering multiple local communities and local relationships? Scott, did you want to pick up that one first, and then Andrew, I'll come over to you on that.
I think it's tough. I think if you've got, we've got 4 sites in Greater Manchester, 2 in Salford and 2 in another local authority in Bury. So it's different, and each local authority kind of has a different approach to dealing with these things. So it has been a challenge, that, and I think you know, we have seen differences in the way that things have been responded to in different local authority areas, and I think a lot of organisations have experienced that as well. I think, you know, understanding the communities that you work in, when you're working as we have done in the communities that we're in for many years, you get a sense of the type of communities that you're working in and how best to kind of respond to it, because you're at the coalface, you're there day in, day out, and they, you know, I think, you know, with the services that we run, you know, they've been around for a long time. They're an integral part of the community, so people kind of engage with us in a different way than maybe they would do with the local authority or with the NHS. So I think we've, you know, I think it's about, there isn't really a quick fire kind of win really with it. It takes time, and it's about having, I think what they've done in Greater Manchester, both in Bury and in Salford, is recognised their community anchors. They've kind of actually said these are anchor organisations that have been here for a number of years, that understand the communities that are working in, and they were really integral in the response phase of this. So in terms of actually kind of reacting, they were actively engaged and brought into that discussion. I think that was really important part of the kind of jigsaw puzzle, really.
Great. Andrew, any thoughts from Possibilities, which obviously works across Rochdale and the whole of the Northwest now?
So just a general point, I think, Scott, would be good just to get your thoughts on what I'm about to say as well, is if you are an organisation of any sort working across multiple geographies, particularly in a crisis, you need to trust and empower your local geographical leaders, because if you try and put a one-size-fits-all, well, you could possibly have a framework, but if you try and micromanage individual decisions to try and make everything match up across geographies, then it'll be really sluggish, and it will lose relevance. So, I mean, Scott, be interesting just to get your perspective, because you're also the chair of Possibilities, so you can speak for them as well. But in my mind, anyway, giving freedom and flexibility to those geographical leaders is really important.
Yeah, I think you know, me and you've had this conversation many times, but I think there's kind of three kind of key ingredients to this stuff. There's kind of trust, you know, and how you trust the staff that work for you and how they trust you. So I think a lot of the stuff during the COVID crisis was based on trust, you know, because you're not, you know, we're in a different kind of, you know, different kind of landscape, aren't we, where people don't actually spend a lot of time together in offices anymore, and you have to trust that things are happening, but also, you know, the staff teams and local people need to trust the organisations as well. And I think there's been, you know, we've been really working on that, and I think some of the work that we did prior to COVID on trust has really paid dividends during the crisis. I think alignment as well is really key. So having clear messaging and alignment of, you know, what are the key priorities, and making sure everyone's clear on what's going on, being very transparent with staff about the challenges that we're facing. I mean, we shut 4 children's day nurseries down in a day. I mean, obviously that was quite traumatic for everyone involved. So I think you've got to be really clear about the messaging and having clear alignment of what the challenges are. And then I think also we need, you know, you've got to be able to kind of hold each other to account during these kind of crises. You know, the public sector's got to be able to hold the people that are doing the things on the ground to account, and vice versa. And I think there's been that kind of really healthy dialogue between, you know, staff in the organisation, between the organisation and the commissioner, between the commissioner and the local community. So I think there's been a lot of really healthy dialogues, and I hope, you know, post-COVID we maintain some of that. We've also got, you know, the potential of what happens post-Brexit as well, which we've kind of stopped talking about a little bit over the last 12 months, but we've got that in the background as well. And I think, you know, there is some real opportunities for there to be a system reset for us to really rethink some of this stuff and do something different in the future.
Right. Yeah, Abby, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I'm a trustee of a large multi-academy trust that has about 17 schools across the Midlands and East of England. And we have, you know, that exact question really. I mean, I think if anything's a community anchor, it's the local school. I think we've all discovered over these last few months how essential our education system is to our lives in lots of different ways. And it's a real struggle to make sure that that local governing bodies, that head teachers, senior staff, that community leaders within each school are have the freedom to be able to respond to the needs of their organisation, but that also we as a trust have that shared value, and that shared values and shared ethos, but I suppose what I really think about it is that it's a bit of a two-way street, and that if you as the larger organisation, as the senior management across a number of geographies, can really prove to your local organisations within your family that you are able to make a contribution to them, that you're supporting them, that you are responding to their needs, then actually I think that can be really successful. That I think you can learn from one geography and bring it to another, you can take advantage of economies of scale. So I think there's lots that can be added from that, but I think it is really important for those larger organisations to be able to prove that they really can support what needs to happen in a local community and respond to it.
Right. I'm really interested in this conversation about what we're talking about, how local authorities can engineer and public service leaders can engineer and push this sort of forward. So, I mean, Scott, just coming back to you quickly on something you said before, and there's a question that's come in on this. You talked about how quickly you moved and responded to the situation. How quickly did you find that your local authority or your public sector partners responded, and could they keep up with the pace that that you did, and how did you find that conversation?
I think it's fair to say that we were a little bit ahead, you know, on a lot of things. You know, we were often putting things into place because we could see what was going on the ground much more clearly. But to give, you know, I have to say, to give our commissioners and the local authority the due, really, they did really step up to the plate as well in terms of this. And I think there's something I think someone's put an anonymous quote about kind of local authorities acting like they own the place during the COVID. And I think there's probably been a bit of a disconnect between kind of the need to kind of centralize these things and have that kind of centralized model and how people feel about that. And I think people do, you know, I think in some respects that has kind of created a bit of resentment between, you know, maybe the sector and local authorities, and, you know, but I think, you know, in the areas that I've worked, they've recognized that, and I think they've wanted to learn from it. I mean, in Bury, for instance, they set up neighborhood leadership groups during COVID, and they're going to continue with that post-COVID. So you can see that they've taken something there that's worked well, and they're going to continue it afterwards. And I think Andrew mentioned this before. I think there is you know, I do talk to people and they want to get back to the normal. They want to get back to the status quo. And I think understanding that isn't actually going to ever happen probably again. And the new normal is going to be very different to the old normal, I think is important. And you know, I think it has demonstrated, it's kind of laid bare a little bit that, you know, when we have a crisis, we can do things really quickly. We can be really agile. We can, you know, we don't have to have really strange procurement exercises to get things done. So I wonder whether or not, you know, there is some learning there for us to take forward from this, and you know, as I've said previously, I think it's a great once in a lifetime opportunity to do a systems reset here.
Yeah. So just again, building on that for you, Andrew, from a strategy point of view. So for those, you know, those community groups, organisations, local authorities having a conversation about the future as we hopefully start to move away from the last few months, what's the key things that you think needs to underpin a strategy for the future that's about respecting the role and the importance of local authorities and the vital job that they do in protecting our communities, and building a forward plan that is about cooperation and community engagement?
Yeah, if I just briefly say something about there are some comments and some chat about councils and local authorities and their approach, and just to really say that councils and local authorities are under a huge amount of pressure at the minute, and they're under scrutiny. They're expected to be leading everything, but let's not forget that a lot of them have been largely hollowed out and finding it very difficult to find capacity to deal with this. So what then happens is, when the pressure is on, different local authorities respond in different ways. Some of the really good ones, which we've been working with, and this is not anything we've done, it's just their approach, has been to be open and accepting about the fact that they can't do everything. And they've really worked to bring in local organisations, local voluntary sector organisations, volunteers. They've looked to establish community hubs where all of that support can come and get directed. They haven't tried to present themselves as being able to control everything, whereas some areas, and I've got an example which I won't name, of one council where the voluntary sector reacted really quickly in a coordinated way to set up community hubs. The council saw that that was a great idea and said, right, we'll take it from here. And the whole thing got clogged up, and there was a lot of frustration there. Now that is not a picture of what always happens, but that leadership approach that a council takes in accepting that they can't do everything is really, really important. And just on your wider point there about strategy, I see someone's asked about that. A number of authorities we're working with are starting their strategic planning now and have been doing it for a couple of months. And that comes back to the point about not recovering to where you were, rather recovering to where you need to be. And a very common theme within those strategies is the acceptance that the council and other public sector bodies can't do everything, and that this is for their area, which is going to take a lot of recovery in terms of employment, in terms of business recovery, in terms of infrastructure. This is everybody's responsibility. So we could talk all day about specific strategies, but starting that conversation now in local areas is incredibly important, because all the effort is going into recovery at the minute, and you need to know where you're trying to get to. And I think that the areas which are most successful are going to be the ones that have a new philosophy about, thinking back to Jamie's different levels of cooperation that embrace all of that, rather than just the bits that are delivered by the public sector. So very happy to have a further conversation with the people who've asked that question, but just not to take up the entire time on it right now.
And Abby, just going further on that, I mean, for those councils looking to sort of take this strategic approach and work in partnership with local communities, what are the tools again that they can use? And particularly, I know Scott sort of said it disparagingly about procurement, and I know you'll tell us that there are so many better ways to do it. So what sort of options and tools could they be adopting to try and promote this kind of community-based ways of working and support communities?
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of local authorities that are carrying out commissioning and procurement brilliantly, and we, every time there's a sort of review of this, they produce hundreds of case studies of commissioners who are really thinking through the issues and coming up with a strategy that's going to really solve some of the problems. And I think we should all be encouraged by that, actually, and by the idea that there is a way to do this, that procurement and commissioning isn't the problem, because we can see lots of councils that are solving it and that are doing well. For me, that it comes down to sort of 3 or 4 different key issues. I think the first of which is the one that Andrew and Scott and all of you are talking about, which is getting really clear about the outcomes right at the beginning of the process, really understanding exactly what it is that the commissioning process or the procurement process is seeking to achieve. Because once that's happened, then the whole thing can flow from that. So from specifying the service, if that's how you want to run the commission, to working out who are the right stakeholders to talk to designing the way in which the procurement process is going to work. So being really clear about what the outcomes that you want to achieve, and thinking widely about that. So what the Social Value Act did was articulate really the existing law, which was around you are allowed to set outcomes which are wider than simply buying envelopes, and to really think about the social value that you can bring in your procurement processes. And then I probably, just for my colleagues, I don't know if there's any amongst our attendees, but for my colleagues in legal and procurement teams in councils, to try and involve them early in that process. I know lots of them are really keen not to be the people that just say no all the time to everything. And the earlier that they're involved in the process, the more they can start to think creatively about what the solutions are. I think the other, if I look at some of the case studies, the other area that I find really interesting is where the evaluation process has been wider, and actually thinking about who does the evaluation. it's really easy, I know I do it in my role, to just think in your own terms and with your own experience, and actually broadening the diversity of who's sitting on evaluation panels, as well as thinking about the evaluation criteria, could be really helpful. And I can think of some good case studies where they've done that and been able to bring something different into the process. And then coming away from a contracting process, I think there was, over the last probably 20, 30 years, we've moved further and further towards contracts and away from grants. But actually thinking about how grants can be used as seed investment, as a growth funds, to try and build on really great community engagement is important. I think local authorities have a huge role to play as investors in their communities, rather than just as purchasers of services. So saying, what is an organisation that I want to invest in, that I think is delivering something which is providing benefits to the community, and is in line with our strategy as a local authority and our policies. So being an investor, I think, is really important. Interestingly, I was having a conversation with somebody from one of the main central government agencies recently, I won't say which one, and she was saying that we were talking about the procurement process, and she said, well, the kind of work that we do, we have to use small contractors because basically the large contractors don't know how to do it. So it's really important that we use small and medium-sized contractors. And she said, so we just use collaboration agreements. And I said, oh, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, what we mean is we put in the money and these organisations put in the services, but it's a collaboration, it's not a contract for services. And I said, and what do your legal team think about that? And she said, yeah, they don't really like it, but I mean, it works for us and we've been doing it for years, so that's what we do. So I think there's I am the lawyer, obviously, on the panel, and I'm not suggesting that we do anything that's unlawful, but at the same time, I think we need to think quite proportionately about what the risks are in certain situations. And sometimes where we've got smaller contracts and we know that we can really get something delivered right, actually we need to take a much more risk-based approach to some of the regulations.
Great, that's brilliant. Scott, just building on a couple of things that have come into the pot, and building on Andrew's points earlier about local authorities thinking about their system plan and their corporate plan going forward. How would you like to be engaged with by the local authorities and the NHS organisations you work with as they start to reset their plan? And there's also a good question coming here, which is about, we all know that stakeholder engagement is really important, but also takes time. So what's that balance, do you think, for someone like you wanting to be part of that conversation, but also making sure local authorities lead and when we move forward and develop these plans so that we can help people quickly recover from the crisis?
I think it's about kind of embedding those assets in the discussion, isn't it? And I think having an asset, and we talked about asset-based approaches a lot pre-COVID, haven't we? And I think having that asset-based approach to COVID recovery is really important. So, for instance, in Salford, I chair the local primary care network. So having the kind of the third sector, the community and voluntary sector and the social enterprise sector embedded in that systems approach is really important. Often, I've seen it done badly in other areas where it's kind of an add-on and it's in the periphery. I think there is a real network across the country now of local authority and NHS spin-outs, which are really have a really interesting role in local areas if you've got those kind of organizations in the mix, because they have all of the kind of links with the sector that they've built up over many years of being part of the sector, but at the same time have all of the agility and resilience of players in the third sector. So they are really interesting parts of the mix, and I think we've seen across the board with the I think there's 120 or so organisations that have emerged from the NHS and local authority that they've really fared well during COVID, and they've responded really quickly. They've worked in partnerships in Salford. When we set up the COVID triage centre, it was ourselves and Salford Primary Care together, who were another NHS spin out, working collaboratively on the ground to actually set something up very, very rapidly. And that's been around the kind of it's not just the kind of the organizational links that they've got, but it's the interpersonal relationships. It's the people stuff. It's the fact that they know each other and they trust each other, and they're able to do that very quickly with each other on the ground. And I think we've seen a lot more of that, and I think we'll see that. I think there is a call to action for the sector as well to actually be more kind of collaborative with each other. I think it's fair to say that often the sector itself isn't very joined up. It's not just about beating the local authorities up and the systems in local areas. It's actually about us making sure that we have more coordination on the ground, and we are able to have partnership arrangements that are responsive and not reactive. We've created a lot of partnerships on the ground as a response to COVID, but what I think we need to do is make sure that they are kind of embedded and they're kind of inbuilt in the communities, so that if we have, God forbid, if this happens again next year or the year after, then we're in a really strong position to actually respond to it again.
Andrew, did you want to build on what Scott said there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you look across the country, and when the inquiries go on into all of this, I think we'll see that the local authorities that have really strong pre-existing connections with communities, that's been a real plus and has enabled, as Scott's just outlined there, a really rapid and flexible response. And on the other flip side of that, I think in areas where there have been some areas where the gulf between the public sector and local communities has been really painfully exposed, and has led to a very sluggish response and frustration on all sides. And I think Scott referred to them as anchor organisations. You could call them bridge organisations, but those in the areas that have responded really well, I think they often have a really strong community-based organisation that has both a relationship with the public sector commissioners and is delivering services on their behalf, but also has really strong ties and a really strong base within communities as well. And the thing that this type of organisation brings that is difficult to do within the public sector and through a traditional outsourced private sector provision is that, as well as providing services that they're contracted for, they're usually charities or social enterprises with a really strong social purpose and mission. And whatever surpluses they have, regardless of their contract, their mission is to do what they can to help communities. And it's those organisations who have very often gone above and beyond within an area, and having those anchor organisations, bridge organisations within an area only builds its resilience and its ability to respond really quickly to something like this. But it's also just a really good way of delivering services and having more of it's an unpopular term, but what you might call a mixed market locally.
Scott, wanted to come in and add on to that?
Yeah, just building on that as well. I think post-COVID, we're going to need, one of the challenges is going to be the money that's going to be in the system and the lack of it. We've kind of, we've maxed out the credit cards, haven't we, during COVID, and there's going to need to be, communities are still going to need investment into them. And I think looking at what the local assets on the ground look like and their ability to raise new money and bring new money into local areas is really important. So the access to things like social investment, being able to kind of bring grant funding into local communities is going to be really important. To allow organisations to adapt to post-COVID, kind of the post-COVID climate, but also to meet the challenges that are going to change dramatically on the ground, and I think we need to be embracing that a lot more in terms of that strategic planning. The fact that they can be, magnets for new investment into cities and can start to, kind of meet challenges without the need for local authorities just to find that money in the system again, because often that's part of the jigsaw puzzle as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we always find is, and there's loads of, everyone's short of money. There isn't enough money in the system, but there's pots of funding for innovation that people aren't aware of. And we've got Co-op Council Innovation Network colleagues on here remind us that they fund innovation. We've all worked through the mutual support program, which funds new ways of working, but half the problem is it's not joined up and we don't all quite know where the funding is, and that goes for local authorities and community groups, what pots they can access. So they're a good challenge for people to try and sort of write some of these things in one place. Abby, did you have anything on the sort of development of strategy and this sort of local anchor institution work, that particularly thinking about asset transfer and some of the challenges there around handing over some of these assets to the community to use going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a frightening thing for a local authority to do, isn't it? To hand over some of these beacon assets, and I think often those that are probably costing the local authority the most money are the ones that are also most associated with the local authority. So things like parks and recreation areas, heritage assets, so museums, theatres, libraries. So those things that probably in voters' mind are what the council does, because they don't really see the huge kind of investment in adult social care and certainly in children's social care. But it's often these frontline assets that are very sort of expensive to run, but are very much seen at the forefront of what the council does. So the idea for an elected member of giving that to the community, and then possibly something going wrong with that is really tough. And I suppose what I would say in those situations is, I mean, we've developed a sort of matrix really of ways in which a local authority can continue to make sure that they are protecting that asset for generations to come, and making sure that that there is a sort of a life to it. Because I think you know, lots of local authorities at the moment, I can think of 2 or 3 that we're working with, are finding it so hard to get focus and to get investment in those assets. But actually the long-term health of the community really does depend on them. I mean, we've all seen how our parks and recreation and sort of outdoor heritage assets have actually been totally central to what we as a community have felt part of, and have felt that we wanted to use and to benefit from. And we know it has an enormous impact on health and well-being. The Heritage Alliance did their annual lecture the year before last about heritage and mental health, and we know that there are a huge amount of research on how those sorts of assets can be used. So I think it is one of the opportunities is to think about moving those assets into the community, allowing them to access different sorts of income streams, allowing them to be to have that sense of ownership from the local area, but at the same time making sure that the local authority can retain the control that they understandably need to protect future and current taxpayers.
I think it's a really good point. We've been working together for 18 months with a council that is desperate to hand over loads of countryside and cultural assets until it worries about what happens if it goes wrong. And then there's also the flip side, and I know Scott and Andrew will know about this from their side as well, about handing over these assets with huge liabilities is a big burden on that community group at the end. So it's about managing that risk and making sure that's being held between the 2 organisations. So I think that, particularly...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some sort of fascinating stuff around that. I mean, you know, from the sort of, you know, big museum in your town or whatever it is, down to the sort of grass verges. And actually, you know, the road I used to live in, not the one I do now, but the road all used to maintain this kind of little grass verge at the top of our road. And it was a sort of perfect example of what every local authority would want, basically, which is the neighbours getting together and coming up with a bit of a rota and remembering to water the wallflowers. You know, we need to try and think of some solutions around that.
Right, so conscious we've only got a few more minutes left. I suppose, sort of, Andrew, final question over to you. What would you say the first steps are for any community group or particularly any local authority looking at this today and saying, actually, you know, we do need to, this kind of community resilience that has come through and come to the fore during COVID, where it works well. We want that because it's a way of running public services, but also so we can build back better. What's the kind of first steps you think from your perspective?
Yeah, so there was a good question in there about will all of this lead to further centralisation, and how can we push back against that? And I think, you know, I'll be very clear, I'm a huge proponent of public services being delivered as close to communities as possible. Now, I think that there will be some challenge to that, and I think it is important to try and push back against it. And in terms of what areas can do practically, I think in order to build better resilience and a better mix of how services are delivered and to get services closer to communities, I think councils need to look at their services in the whole, doing an assessment across each one to decide which absolutely have to be delivered by the council, solely by the council, and which can actually be pushed down to either be delivered through community hubs or through those bridge or anchor institutions. And I think if the lessons aren't learned in terms of which areas have responded best to this crisis and the public service model that they have, then that'll be a real shame. And then I think it's really important to look at those services and think about ownership. So Scott's organisation is co-owned by service users and the staff. Now that's the kind of exemplar, let's say, but you can do quite a bit without going the whole way there. But I think it's really important to think about ownership. And a problem that some areas have experienced is that when they've gone out to communities and said, we really want to engage with you, your communities aren't used to that, and they've been saying, well, hold on a minute, I'm used to you telling us what to do. So building general community capacity and giving people permission to actually get involved is really important. And some areas are looking at citizens' assemblies, neighbourhood forums, all of which helps answer some of the questions around democratic deficit. If you're going to push down these services and decisions, how do you actually square that circle? So there's a lot of things that the areas can do to prepare for the future and build resilience, but they'll be different in every area because they're all starting from different places.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Well, just conscious of time, and if people will have other places to be heading off, so hopefully you can see my screen again with our contact details. I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think we could have continued that discussion for at least another hour and maybe more, because that's a really fascinating discussion, and I think we only scratched the surface of a lot of discussion topics. So if you want more information, if you want to see the framework that we've been developing, or visit our website, or get in touch with any of us on the panel, and obviously hopefully you can see our details there. We're there to support and help people in any way they can. But as we look to build back from the crisis, I think we've proven today that this is a discussion very much of its time, and one where there's a lot of exciting opportunities, but also a real need to make sure we do that in order to help people recover from what's been a challenging few months, and to sort of deal with some of the challenges that have been laid bare. So thank you all very much for everyone who's joined, everyone who asked their questions, and sorry I couldn't get to all of them. We'll make sure we collate them, and any thoughts we'll add into some notes that we'll prepare on our webpage. But I hope you all have a fantastic day, and look forward to hearing from many of you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.